Hey guys, welcome to my first ever episode of Pivot Well by Sarah. I'm super excited to get this podcast up and going off the ground. It's been a couple years in the making and we're finally here. The idea behind this podcast was I create a podcast that I would have needed 10 years ago. It has nothing to do with my age and everything to do with my mental and emotional health. I want this to be a platform where people can find their wellness in a three-pronged approach. I think a lot of people focus on one aspect of health, and that's physical health or diet or exercise. And those things are very important. I think that your mental and spiritual health are just as critical. I believe that my mental health has, healing that part of me has helped me more in my chronic illness than physical health has ever. I mean, I've had benefits from, I've been on medication for years now, and of course that helps me, but the thing that helped me the most was my mental health. And so I realized that there is much more to your body than just the physical aspects. So I wanted to make a podcast and go over what I've done to get to where I am. My story is crazy. It's all over the place. Part of the setback for this podcast was figuring out how do I make this? Where do I start? What are people looking for? And I think I've realized that people want encouragement. They want hope. They want to feel not so alone in their struggles. I think 10 years ago, if I think about this, and the idea of this podcast is it's something that I would listen to 10 years ago and help myself. What do I need? What did I need then? And so 10 years ago, I would have needed to know that I wasn't alone. I remember feeling so isolated in life at that point. I felt like nobody had ever gone through what I was going through. I was going through a lot of overcoming emotional abuse. I had medical trauma I was dealing with. I had parents who had separated at a young age and remarried. There was a lot of dysfunction. I mean, there's a lot of drama, and it's again overwhelming to unpack. So I'm gonna kind of try to do this in stages and focus on the things that I feel have really made a difference in my life. I have been in therapy for 9 years now almost, and that's crazy to think, but it has saved my life. It has made all the difference in the world. I've done CBT therapy, I've done EMDR, and I've done IFS, which is a newer one, and I wish more people would do it. It's called Interfamily Systems, and my therapist more commonly refers to it as parts work. So I probably will say that more in this podcast, but that's the same thing. And the idea is that we are comprised of a bunch of parts of ourselves that we have created throughout our experiences. Often people say that's your various personality traits. I think that's a common way that I see it being used, but they're very telling of your past and your history, and they all have served you in some way. Even the ones that you don't like have served you somewhere in life. It's figuring out how do they serve you and how are they now hindering you, and rather than getting rid of them, how do we have them work together to make the best version of you? And that sounds, I know, a little crazy and out there, but there's a lot of science behind it and a lot of truth behind it. And as I share my story, I think you'll probably be able to see the origin of a lot of my parts and what they've done for me. So yeah, I'm super excited to get into this podcast. I will cover, like I said, the healing of myself emotionally, but I'll also talk about my ADHD, things that I've learned along the way. I was, like a lot of women, diagnosed later in life, and it's been interesting to find out what is the cause of a lot of my issues. But like now at this age, how do I cope with them? What do I do to deal with ADHD as an adult now that I've gone through a lot of my, school and things like that? It's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot behind that. So we'll dive into that as well. And I am going to talk about some changes I've made in my life to help me from the physical side, as in my diet, exercise, and just some other holistic, I guess, approaches to my health. So yeah, I'm super excited to have you guys join this journey. And we can make a great community that is focused on just bringing people together and helping with that loneliness that so many people feel around these things, as well as being an encouragement and a hope. So maybe something I say resonates with you, and you can see how I've worked to overcome those struggles. So I'm going to start with just like a little bit of a background of my story. I will do kind of like a high level overview of it because we will dive into it throughout the podcast as it pertains to different topics. But just so you have this for reference, I was born in 1994, so I'm 31 years old. And when I was born, I had an older sister, and she was like my best friend growing up. We were like twins. She was 2.5 years older than me, which I love that age difference actually. So if you're in the stage of having kids, that's a great age difference. But it was nice because we went through a lot and we went through it together. My parents separated when I was 3 years old. I think I was like 3 or 4. There's a lot of debate on when that actually happened in my family, but my sister and I moved in with my grandparents. My dad moved us in with him to my grandparents' house, and that is where I spent some of the best years of my life, at my grandparents. They were wonderful people. They passed away, but their legacy lives on, and you will see throughout my story how I only lived with them for 4 years, but those 4 years were critical for me in shaping the person I am today. They showed me a lot of love, and they showed me respect and worth. They taught me I was valuable. They taught me a lot about my faith, and that set a foundation that would later on benefit me. My dad remarried when I was 8 years old, and he married a woman who we didn't get along very well. I'll say it that way. We'll talk about that later. But when I first met her, when we first moved in with her, we met her, I guess I was still living with my grandparents. And it's a situation where I think I'm trying to find like the best way to approach this topic. It's still something I'm trying to like figure out how to navigate, but there was a lot of abuse that happened because of that marriage. I dealt with a lot of emotional abuse and some other things. And that's, I think, a part of me that has been really helpful with people who have dealt with narcissistic partners. She was very much narcissistic, and I think she was a product of her own traumas that were unresolved, which that's, something I want to dive into as well. What happens when you have these traumas that you don't resolve? They can create a lot more problems, and I think she was an example of that. Her mom, when we first moved in, she was my grandmother as well, Mama Ruth. She was a wonderful woman though, and I think she was probably the most maternal part of that house. She was so kind. She grew up in the Great Depression. She was a lot older when she had my stepmom. So she taught me how to cook, how to sew, a lot of those fun things. And when I was, I think, 10 years old, she had a stroke, and it left her paralyzed on one side of her body. And that was when I really started to have like this big change in my life, where I was expected to do a lot of things more like an adult. And I think that's where I first saw my childhood start to be taken away from me. At 10, I was doing a lot of things like a caretaker should have been doing. They should have hired someone to do this, or my stepmom should have done it herself. But my sister and I did it, and I was fine with it. I did love to help people. I was raised to be very helpful, and so I thought this is something I could do for her for good. And then she had another stroke, or she had like 2 strokes while she was alive, and then she had a final stroke that was really bad, and my sister and I were actually the ones that found her. She had fallen on the floor, and that was probably one of my most traumatic things at that point in my life, was to find her in that situation. She did pass away, and everything changed when she did, because she, I think, was a buffer for my stepmom. I think looking back, that was kind of like her safety net, if you will. We didn't notice anything because we had this very maternal woman in our life, Mama Ruth, and she was very good to us. But when she passed, I think it was kind of like that breaking point for my stepmom. And simultaneously, my parents had been, I guess, doing foster classes for foster care, and we got our first set of foster kids, which changed my life in many ways. But the best thing to come out of that was the first little boy and girl we got. We adopted the little girl later on after a series of events. The little boy went back to his father, but we adopted her, and she's now my little sister, and I love her dearly. Actually, one of the reasons I want to make this podcast as well is for her. I want her to be able to see how her big sister went through things from a different perspective. I talk to her all the time, but having it as like a podcast, I think would be really nice to document for her, but in others as well in that same situation. But yes, I first met her. She was 3 years old, and my sister and I became caretakers to her and her brother. And then we got 2 more foster kids. And so while my stepmom was grieving this loss, we were honestly supposed to be grieving this loss, but we were not doing a great job because I didn't know how to grieve a loss at that point. This was the first loss I had ever had. So I kind of just thought it would go away at 10 years old, you know. Well, I guess at this point I was 12. I think she had her first stroke when I was 10, and I think I was 12 when we first got our first foster kids. And yeah, my sister and I had to grow up really fast. We had to become parents to these kids. We would take them in the morning to the bus stop. We would get them ready, take them there. We'd make sure they had their backpacks, lunches. Then when they would come home, then we would go to school. Then when they would come home, my sister and I would do a lot of their homework. No, we would do all their homework with them, clean up after them, do their laundry, do the cleaning, often do dinner, watch the kids, made sure they were taken care of. I think my sister and I taught them how to read, how to write, a lot of them. And it was very overwhelming I was a little girl taking care of kids, you know. Even my sister at that point, she was 15, and she was taking on a lot of responsibility, and it was a lot for us. And so a couple years went by, and I started high school. Now, it was actually crazy. I got to go to high school, which I know is wild. My sister did not get to go to high school for some reason, which we can talk about later. I'll dive into some of these details a little bit more later. But she had to get her GED, and then she went to community college. And so I was very shocked I was allowed to go to high school. I really didn't think I was going to get to go. But I did. I went to a college prep school that I got into, and it was great. I loved it. It was a charter school, and there I met my very best friend outside of my family, Caitlin. I'll probably talk about her throughout this podcast, but it was an interesting experience because I had this school I was going to. A lot was expected of me. We were taking like Latin. We were taking a bunch of like logic and rhetoric and things like that. I don't know. The classes were very different than what I was used to. I had gone to a smaller school for elementary school. So there was a shock to that. There's a lot of homework that came with it. And then on top of that, taking care of the kids and making sure they were getting where they needed to be, and, you know, juggling all of this at that age was a lot. And I remember when I was in my second half of the year, in my freshman year, I was 15, I started getting really sick, and I ended up having a lot of series of events that led to this, which I think it's kind of something that I'm still working on processing right now. One of the hardest traumas I went through was my medical trauma, and it started then, and I was in high school, and I remember just getting sicker and sicker, and then all of a sudden I was in the hospital, and I was being told I had Crohn's disease, and I didn't know what Crohn's disease was. I was actually really happy it wasn't cancer because I was afraid I was going to have cancer. And it ended up, and I thought, well, I don't know what Crohn's disease is, and people, I'm sure, don't die from that. And I did. I almost died. I came really close several times. I had 7 surgeries over 2 years. I had an ileostomy, a feeding tube, drains. I ended up getting peritonitis, which was what caused a lot of these other things to happen. And I really leaned into my disassociation at that point. I don't remember a lot of this. It's something I'm still trying to figure out. I see it as happening in 1 year, but it actually ended up happening over 2 years. And so there was 32 weeks in the hospital over 2 years. And I'm very lucky to be alive. I'm very grateful to be alive. It was absolutely a miracle. I'll share that story. A lot of things I'm giving you here that will be like sneak peeks. So we'll talk about these things as we go, and I'll dig into them a little bit more. But yeah, it was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my life, but also one of the most affirming of my faith. And going back to my original comments, I talked about how your physical health is affected by your mental health. It's no coincidence that the most stressful time in my life was when I had my first major flare-up of Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. And autoimmune is triggered by elevated cortisol levels, which is stress. So if you're living in a fight or flight state, which I was at that point, it can cause a lot of health issues. And mine actually ended up being, Crohn's disease. And that's how it manifested there. I always tell people, if whatever's in your mind will manifest into your body, and whatever it is, whether it be good things or bad things. And I want to be careful with the word manifest, because I know that's a big word used nowadays, and I'm more meaning it as in it cultivates in your body. And I'll talk later about why I guess the word manifest, I think some people rely too much on it. I think manifestation is kind of some people's way of thinking that they can control things by their words, when I really believe that manifestation is your mind thinking something and then you working hard towards whatever that is. But anyway, I know that's kind of controversial. We'll talk about that another time. But anyway, so I ended up surviving, and it was a huge miracle. I mean, a huge miracle. Everybody in my community thought I was going to die, and they were all super excited when I lived. And then there was this weird moment of just a drop off afterwards. Okay, well, I lived, now what? And I ended up going back home, and I just was thrown right back into the life I had lived prior to it. It caused a lot of issues for me mentally. I dealt with, like I said, I still deal with major PTSD, and that's something that I'm trying to work through. That's one of the reasons I started EMDR and the inner family systems, was because I don't know how to process this part of my life. So I'm going to save that story for later. But what happened in that time was it opened up a whole new world for my stepmom, and that was kind of like a Munchausen by proxy, but for mental health, which I know it's often commonly associated with people like Gypsy Rose and her situation, where she was physically affected by that. But mine was, my stepmom had every single person in our family, every single person diagnosed with something, and they were all put on lots of medication. So I came out of the hospital, and of course I did not acclimate well back into the real world, because first of all, I had to drop out of high school in that period. Shocker. It's just crazy how it works. My sister got her GED. I had to go on to get my GED. My stepmom had gotten her GED. So it was something I think she really wanted us to follow in her footsteps there. I actually was very upset that I had to drop out of it. But yeah, I had to drop out of high school. So then I was just taken to get my GED. And the only fun part of life, which I thought high school was taken away from me. And then things just got significantly worse over the next few years. And my mental health did take a toll. And I ended up eventually running away from home. I put air quotes. I was 19 when it happened, but it was not easy. It was a situation where you had to run away. It wasn't like I had the option of just leaving home. And I moved to Florida. I moved down here, and I had some family friends that lived down here. They helped me get on my feet, and I will talk a ton about them, I'm sure, in this podcast, because they were truly pivotal in my life and helping me. It was the difference of having no support system and then seeing them as a support system and just feeling that change. And it really goes to show you how important community is. I had met them through church. And so I am a big believer in finding a community. That's your first thing, I think, in your mental health, is finding a community, wherever it may be. But anyway, so yeah, I moved down here with them. And when I came down here, they knew me when I was younger. So when I moved down here, they could see this difference in my personality. They would say I was like a zombie. I would just walk around completely nothing behind the eyes. And it was a consequence of all the medication I had been put on by my stepmom. She had worked with a psychologist, and a doctor to get me on massive amounts of psychiatric medication, which I was a very strong-willed person. I've always been a very strong-willed person. From day one, I was strong-willed. So I think that my attitude and that she would call it defiance. I would just say like me calling her out on her BS. She hated that. She hated it. I was always challenging her on things because she would lie to me constantly. And I knew better. I knew that wasn't right. And so I think her way of dealing with me was by putting me on a lot of medication. And the psychologist she worked with and her it was a toxic situation. And I kind of hope he sees this and knows how much he messed up my life, because truly that was my downfall. Like, a lot of bad could have happened had I not ended up getting in the right place and getting the right help after that. But I moved to Florida, and the first thing I wanted to do was get off of these medications. And I knew I needed to do it safely. And how I had the know-how to do a lot of the things I did throughout my story, I attribute to God, because I don't know. I knew to get a credit card a year before I left and build up my credit. I have no idea how I knew to do that. Because at this point I was probably like, I would say 13, 14, 15 years old, actually. I was emotionally stunted there, which, if you know, in trauma, often somebody, when they have a serious traumatic event, they get emotionally stunted at that age. So 15, I was one of my worst traumas. So I found the psychiatrist, and she worked with me to get me off the medications. And I remember she saw all the things I was on, and she was like, "This is enough for a grown man with schizophrenia. I don't know how you," that's a quote unquote there. She was so surprised at how much medication I was on. And considering just like my size, she's like, as a young woman, this is just way too much. And so I think she could realize that this was more than, like, there was something else more going on. And so I kind of told her a little bit about what's going on, as best as I could at that point. And she was so great. She helped me taper off of the medication, but she was like, "You need to see a therapist. That's not my role. I can help you with this medication, but you really need to work with a therapist through these things that you're talking about." And I was like, no, because I'd had a terrible experience with a psychologist in the past. But it ended up 6 months later, I was dealing with a lot of panic attacks. And one day I just hit the rock bottom of my life, which, I mean, there's been quite a few rock bottoms, actually. Rock bottoms happen, guys. But I was in a pretty low spot, and I remember I'd put the card in a drawer. And so I went and looked in the drawer. It was in my hairbrush drawer, like my hairbrush and straightener and all that. It was at the bottom, and I remember pulling it out and thinking, let me just call her. Like, maybe I should just call her. And part of me thought, yeah, I'll do this, and then she'll tell me I'm not crazy. And then I'll be fine. And I thought I would probably go 3 or 6 months max to therapy. And here I am 9 years later. Same therapist. She has changed my life for the better. If you are ever on the fence about going to see a therapist, it can be a matter of your literally life or death if you find the right one. And I tell people finding a therapist is like shopping for a car. You can drive one around and see how it goes. If you don't like it, find the next one. But you need to find someone who is not biased. So the person should not always be telling you you're right. Don't let them enable you. But also, they shouldn't be telling you what to do. That's a sign of a bad therapist if they're telling you what to do. One thing I love about my therapist is she would guide me in the direction I needed to go, but she would not ever say, well, this is what you need to do, Sarah, and this is what you need to do. And, she would just work with me through these things and give me a better perspective around things. She kept a great healthy distance. 9 years, and I still feel she's my therapist and not my friend. I would think of her as a friend, but not like, a normal friend. She's my therapist. I don't know anything about her life, and it's a very professional relationship. And that's another thing. I know some people are very close to their therapist. I see some of my friends go, and I'm like, no, you shouldn't know all that about your therapist. It should be about you. But anyway, she's always been just very, very good with me, and I'm so grateful I found her. I went on to get my college degree. I worked my way through college. I worked as a server at Olive Garden, and I used to babysit, and I also worked at my school's library. At some points, I would clean houses too. I would do anything I could to make ends meet because I had a lot of expenses, and I was not helped by my parents, obviously. I kind of run away. But it was this trial by fire, thrown in the deep end, and I didn't know how to swim, but I learned really quickly. And through all of that, through all the ups, all the downs, I had a great support group. I had my faith, and I had mental health support. And I think that's what was the matter of me ending up in a successful job and happily married versus a lot of other situations I know that I could have ended up in. And many other people who went through what I did would have ended up in those. And there's nothing wrong with that. I feel like no matter where you are in life, there's always a chance to turn it around. There's always a chance to turn it around. One of my favorite things is reading those articles about people, celebrities, or successful people who didn't get their start until they were older. I'm 31, and now I'm like starting this podcast, and who knows what will happen with it, but I'm not, I never feel like it's too late to make the best out of your life. And I want to use this platform as a space to do that. I want to encourage you guys that there is hope beyond your trauma, and you are not defined by your trauma. I don't want my identity to be what I went through. I want it to be what I became, who I am now. And all of those things that I went through and all those parts of myself make up Sarah, the person you're sitting here listening to today. And it's a beautiful thing, and I'm excited to be able to share it. I really hope that I can make a difference in your life, and I hope you can make a difference in mine as well. So if you've gotten this far, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you will follow along for this journey, subscribe to my channel, and leave some comments if you have any questions, if you want me to dive into anything deeper that I have brought up. Of course, a lot of these things I will break down and talk about in sections, but if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will answer them in the next episode. And again, thanks for joining, and I'm excited to start this journey with you.